I'm Anya. I'm 21. My major and career path, so I'm doing health policy for my undergrad and getting my master's in public administration. So I'm hoping to maybe go into the public health field or the public policy field. And my ethnic background is Indian. My family is Gujarati. My mom immigrated to the U.S. when she married my dad. And my dad was born here. His parents immigrated to the U.S. to Connecticut, like in the '60s, I think. And so I grew up in like a suburban town in Connecticut. It was a pretty nice, I had a good time growing up. Like, went to a good school and everything. But I kind of always knew that like my family background was a little bit different, knowing that, I'm first generation on my mom's side and growing up in an Indian household definitely had some like cultural differences. Um, Obviously the food's better, so that was good. But there definitely were some things that, stood out to me as different from like my American peers. I think parenting styles a little bit. I think that my mom being a stay at home mother definitely I think influenced that. And she had a very hands-on approach. She was very like involved in me and my sister's life. I have one sister, she's 18 months older than me. And I think that was honestly really beneficial to us. There was a lot that she could teach us that like I think we wouldn't have had the opportunity to otherwise. But it also kind of meant that she was very involved in our lives and like had a lot of say of like what we wore and what we did, especially growing up, like becoming like a teenager that kind of like had its own struggles and stuff like that. Yeah, I think that it definitely did in the sense that I think sometimes I felt like I was missing out. Like when I started growing older, when I was younger, of course, like you don't think about that stuff, but I think that um it kind of came full circle like when I did go to college and I had the opportunity to like, really choose my own path more so than I did in high school. I think that I kind of became more appreciative of it, but I think in high school it was definitely a little bit more of a struggle to like, not necessarily feel like I had like I say in like my expression, like my self-expression and like stuff like that. But I think that yeah, I definitely am much more appreciative of it now and I don't have like FOMO or anything like that, which is good. Yeah, I feel like I've definitely had my own mental health struggles. I think that I haven't been diagnosed with anything. I'm not on any medication, but it would suffice to say that I definitely have had mental health struggles. I think that definitely through certain like personal experiences, like negative experiences, like sexual encounters and stuff like that, it's definitely impacted my mental health and kind of like I think at one point I thought that it was just like depression, but then I actually got involved in some like clinical studies at Yale and like found out that I actually have PTSD basically. Like it hasn't been diagnosed by a professional one-on-one, but it's pretty clear that that's like what I'm struggling with. And so I think that that has definitely like having the ability to like put a name to my struggle has been helpful, but I think it's also hard because I kind of am like oh shit, like I struggle with PTSD, like that's like definitely a major thing that a lot of people like don't really think is possible for them. Like you only really hear about that in like really extreme cases. But yeah, I think that that's something that I have come to terms with more recently. I've been able to talk about it with my sister a little bit. My family knew that I was participating in the like health trials or whatever it was like brain scans, and but from what I understood, because what I was going when I was going into it, it was just looking at brain scans in youth with like mood disorders or something like that, and I was like, that doesn't necessarily mean you have a mood disorder. That was just the name of the study. But then moving forward, it became pretty clear that I was not in the control trials. I was more of the other trials. So talking to my sister was definitely helpful, I think. She's in medical school right now, so she has like some awareness of, what like mental health treatments are out there and like, what mental health struggles are because I'm sure she's had her own struggles as well. But it's been kind of hard like not being able to be fully open about it with my parents, I think. But they are aware of like certain things. Like I think they're aware that there are certain things that I'd like to like improve on, and like we have talked about the potential of me going to therapy, but it's never actually happened. I think that they would definitely, feel bad. Like they would definitely would, take it seriously. But I think that they also would be like much more concerned and like think that it was a much bigger, like pressing issue than maybe I would be ready for. Because obviously, like I would also need to be ready to take that step to like go to therapy. And like even though I think about it, I don't know if I necessarily am. So I think that it would kind of, they would definitely care and like want to make it, want to make a difference, but I don't know if it, like their version of how to make a difference would necessarily align with mine. I think that like cultural beliefs have definitely like influenced my parents' perception of mental health, my like family in general, my community in general. Um, and I think that it also kind of has influenced mine. I think that a lot of times the first like go to is kind of like meditation and like well-being and like, like eating healthy and stuff like that is kind of like the first way that I would say like my family kind of addresses mental health issues or like, emotional issues versus something like medication or like, going the pharmaceutical route, which I definitely see the value in. And I think that that's honestly like been beneficial to like the way that I deal with things. Um, I don't think that my personal coping mechanisms are necessarily like the most healthy, but like just knowing that that is an option for me and like that's something that I can connect to is like helpful. I think that sometimes also the downside of it is that, if somebody is genuinely struggling and needs like a more like medical intervention or a different type of intervention, like psychiatric help, it might be harder to approach that because the kind of thinking behind that is that you can fix yourself or that you have the ability to fix yourself through like the ways that you change your behavior, which sometimes isn't always the case. I would say like we're both a little bit against that, both myself and my family. But I think that if it were to come to a point where I would start wanting to take a medication for, my whether it be for PTSD or for another mental health struggle, I think that they would definitely be opposed at first. And I think that obviously there is good reason, that like getting on medication is, can do a lot to your body and like can be really hard process. But I think that sometimes it is necessary, and I think that they would definitely only like really look at the negatives more than the positives. So I haven't really thought about it that much because I don't feel like I personally want to be on medication. But if there were to be a point in my life where I did, I think that probably would be an issue. Yeah, I would say like I think that the stigmas that are around mental health, at least in my family and just my, Indian community in general, I think are pretty similar to the ones that I see in the West. Like, you know, there still is stigma around talking about mental health, I think, and I think that's kind of normal in a sense, or it's been normalized. Um, but I think that the differences specifically within like the Indian community, I think can be like how we talk about somebody who has mental health struggles. I think again, like sometimes the blame is put on the individual rather than, the broader social context that they might be living in or, the fact that they might just simply lack the coping mechanisms to fix themselves if that's even possible. Um, so I think that that kind of has influenced a little bit. Yeah, I think some challenges that I've personally encountered are just like having I would say a conversation about mental health that kind of aligns with the way that I think about it. I think that there's like, when I've taken classes around mental health, I've taken like the sociology of mental illness and like another sociology class that was like drugs and society and stuff like that. So I've learned like the language that we're supposed to use. I've learned like, oh, like this is like the correct term or this is how we talk about alcoholism or substance use and stuff like that. But I think when you talk to like in a community or you're talking to some people who haven't necessarily learned it in academia, but versus through their own personal experiences, they might have a different way of looking at it. And I think that that's one challenge that I've come across is like they're not necessarily wrong in how they feel and think, but I think that it definitely is conflicting with what I've learned is correct. I think one instance that I can kind of remember is like after a personal experience that was really hard for me and I was like coping through it. I think that I had like a pretty difficult conversation with my mom, like, around mental health, and, I know that she, like, wanted to take it seriously and she wasn't trying to, like, invalidate my feelings, but I think it was hard for her seeing her daughter, like, in distress and, like, kind of feeling a little helpless in that moment maybe, and I think that I just wasn't ready to, like, have the conversation that she wanted to have, so that's definitely been, like, a challenge, and I think it's also hard, like I said earlier, like, when I know how I'm feeling and I know the right way to talk about it, but that's not necessarily like what they perceive is the issue that I'm dealing with. And so like if I say I'm dealing with like a mental health struggle, and they're like, well, you should go to the gym more and like, you can eat healthier and like why aren't you eating healthier? It's like you might be right. Like you definitely might be right, but it's not necessarily like what I want to hear in that moment. So I think that's like a challenge and like one instance I remember that like was difficult. I think there are like certain differences culturally. I mean, of course my dad is also Gujarati and grew up with first gen parents like in the 80s and stuff. And so there are still a lot of things that they, agree on within like, that Indian culture that I also like, definitely see the value in. But I think that less so with mental health. I think they both have like similar views on mental health if I'm not mistaken. And like, the value in addressing mental health issues and stuff like that. But I think that there's other cultural things. Like I remember one time, like this is really random, but I remember one time like my mom was like, "Oh, you shouldn't like wear your hair down when you go to school. You should put it up in a ponytail so that you can just focus on your work and like it can be out of your face." And I was like, "I want to wear my hair down. Like I'm going to wear my hair down. Like that's a really normal thing to do." And my dad was like, "Yeah, like it's really normal. Like it's okay if she wants to wear her hair down." And like I know my mom wasn't trying to be controlling in that moment. It was just a cultural difference and it was like, "Okay, to us it's like a super normal thing, but like the way that she grew up in India, I'm sure like everyone had their hair back like when they were at school so they can just like focus on like reading and doing their work." I think there's definitely like generational differences. I think like with us, we have like social media and we have like, the internet to kind of explore like what do other cultures do, what do other people do, and stuff like that. Um, to address mental health issues or just, in general when it comes to like mental health and the way that we talk about it. I think that obviously our parents are also on the internet, but their internet is very different and also they grew up very different. And so I think that. I think one of the major generational differences that I'm kind of noticing now, which could be like within the South Asian community, but also like just in general, is the idea of like laziness kind of having to do with like mental health struggles and like depression and things like that versus the way that like we see it sometimes in our generation is that like there's other like socioeconomic reasons why people may not want to work or they may have like struggled to get out of bed and stuff like that. And so I think that's something that I've noticed. Yeah. I think also just even like generationally with my grandparents, like so my dad's parents still live in Connecticut and stuff and I'm pretty close with them. And I think that like it's interesting to see that, I don't really talk to my grandparents about like mental health and like we don't talk about depressing things when I'm with them. But I definitely have noticed that like they have much more like self-reliant coping mechanisms versus I think people in our generation tend to turn outwards for coping mechanisms. That also has to do with like shame. And I think that if you kind of like are admitting outwardly to other people that you're struggling with something, it can cause a sense of shame and like, oh, you shouldn't talk about that. Like you shouldn't let that be known. So I think that kind of has something to do with it as well. I think definitely speaking of like the white therapist, like I went to like Shaw and like did their like whatever they have that course therapy thing where you can like do a few sessions and they stuck me with this like white male therapist and it was not the best experience, like not to say that it was like a bad experience necessarily, but it wasn't nearly as helpful as I think it could have been in that moment when I think I was dealing like with some insomnia in freshman year and I definitely like needed to like talk to somebody about what I was dealing with and like potentially seek treatment. And I noticed that whenever I was talking about my parents or talking about like just in general, like even if it didn't have to do with something cultural, the therapist would assume that it was a cultural issue and like they kind of blamed that as to why my parents weren't understanding what was happening, which I felt like wasn't really their place to do. And it kind of also invalidated like my struggles and stuff like that, and kind of was just like, oh, it must be a cultural difference and stuff like that. And I was like, well, that's not really what I'm talking about, but okay. Um, but like, so yeah, so that was like an interesting experience that I definitely think that if I had had a more like culturally competent therapist, probably would have been able to help me better. And I think another barrier to like seeking mental health therapy or, treatment in general is the fact that like cost is a big thing. And I think sometimes, at least from what I understand, like my parents and I know like some of my other friends that are Indian, like their parents, they don't necessarily see therapy as like the thing that they would want to spend their money on. Like they see the value in it, but it's like, okay, but is it worth that much? Because therapy is expensive and like, obviously like we have insurance and stuff, but it's still like not necessarily covered because of like other issues in our society. So I think that that's something that I'm like, okay, I understand that like it is a big issue, like the cost and stuff, but sometimes it's worth it. Like if we can spend on this, why can't we spend on that? I think that awareness within like the Indian community definitely can be improved just by talking about it more. I think I've noticed that like by talking to my parents about it, and even like obviously they have their own mental health struggles, I'm sure themselves, and like them coping with that. I think being able to talk about it and understand that like it's normal to go through that, but it's not normal to like struggle silently. I think definitely can like help those like overcome that like shame and stigma. And I think like just beyond talking about it, I think also like education would be great. I mean, like I don't know what the education can be for somebody who like doesn't go to school, like not like the typical education, but I think like being open to different like perspectives and ideas, and like I know like I might have been resistant to some of the things that my parents were saying growing up, but now that I'm older, I'm like, okay, well, it actually does make sense to like try and meditate and eat better and like work out. Maybe that does make me feel better versus just like, assuming that, what I thought would be the best course to go through that wasn't really culturally what I, what am I trying to say? That wasn't really like culturally aligned with like Indian culture. Might have been not as good of a route to take. So. Yeah, I think like within my community, like I will say I don't like go to those like big garbas anymore like we did when we were younger and stuff like that. But I still like think that my friends who are Indian or South Asian in general, like um between us, I think that people do talk about mental health, but I think sometimes it can come across as like a joke almost, like, oh my God, we're all struggling, like blah, blah, blah. So I think that it's cool to see like people taking it more seriously and like really like wanting to help each other out now versus like it kind of just being a joke that you brush off. And then with like my family and like my parents, I think that their evolution has also been positive, but a little bit different in the sense that like I think they were previously opposed to maybe me seeking out like more Western ideas of mental health treatment. I could be wrong about that, but that was the impression that I got. And now I think that they are open to the idea of me going to therapy and like, obviously cost is an issue, but I think, being able to say that like we're open to this idea is a big step to take. And then the logistics you can figure out later. I think it's because we know that it shouldn't be stigmatized, but it still kind of is in the sense that like, yeah, we can talk about it. We can say like, oh, I have PTSD, like I'm struggling with depression, like bro, like I just want to kill myself right now. Like those types of things. Like obviously people are gonna still say that. Like I still say that all the time. But I think that like we don't take it as seriously because that means that we probably would have to then cope. That we then would have to like do that like internal like work of like improving and then it would be more real. I think that that is a little bit of the case. Like, even though we've definitely like generationally overcome a lot of the shame and stigma around mental health and we've started talking about it more openly, I think that personally everyone still has their own struggles. And I mean, we've seen that like on our campus, we've seen that like throughout the world. So I think that like by joking about it, it makes it easier to kind of like brush off and not take so seriously. I think that support systems is a really interesting like term. I think that that is definitely something that our community like can build. I don't know if it already exists, which it might. But it would be really cool to see like a South Asian like mental health like community, or like some sort of like what's it called, like a group therapy or something like that, but specifically for our community would be really awesome. I think maybe also if there was a way that we could have like, oh, like I know this really great South Asian therapist that's like taking new clients, stuff like that, like a bulletin board or something like that would be really cool. Because I think that that is what a lot of people who maybe are ready to take the step to address their mental health issues, but they can't because of those like other, like I said before, like logistical issues, or even just like maybe a fund, like a mutual aid fund would be really cool, specifically within our community. I know that like sometimes like this does exist for like LGBTQ folks or like sex workers and stuff like that. And I know it's not like the same exact thing, but it'd be really cool just to have like an affinity group like specifically dedicated to mental health in like South Asian communities. I think that'd be really awesome. There's definitely support systems out there, but I think that, you know, it's hard to reach out, and it's hard to like, you know, especially when you are not like engulfed within like the community. I know that there is like a Connecticut based Indian community, but like not everyone's part of that just because you're Indian. And I think that that can kind of make it a little like disenfranchised and harder to like find resources. I think that maybe it's not there yet because like you said, like maybe some people aren't ready to start discussing it. And I think that it takes a lot to start one of those, like, you know, whether it be a nonprofit or just like a group in general. It definitely takes resources and time. And I think that if maybe the people who are interested, like obviously you're interested in this topic, like I am too, if we knew that there was like an audience out there that also is interested, then maybe it would come together. But I think that sometimes it's very like I said, disenfranchised, and like, you know, people live in different places and they don't necessarily talk about these things like on a regular basis, or like if they do want to reach out to help, they probably go through the very typical avenues, like, you know, like going on like psychology.com and like trying to look up like Asian woman like therapist near me and stuff like that, and like not getting anybody. And at least I know I've done that and like it can be hard. So I think that people probably just like haven't gotten around to like really thinking about it and talking about it. I think I would tell them that there is a community out there for them, that there are people that understand not just the mental health struggle that they're going through, but how their culture and their background impacts that struggle, and how that their culture and background can also support them getting the help that they need, and that there are people that care. That's what I would tell them.